There is a great joy in studying the ancient texts that have shaped our cultures and understanding of the world. One of these joys is in finding commonalities between stories. And while some would find it alarming to see a literary device in this text over here as a copy and paste in this one over here, I think the parallels are far more nuanced than that. Let me explain. Take Achilles, the hero of Homer's Iliad, and David, the great king of Old Testament Israel, for example. Both men were immensely skilled with musical instruments, the lyre for Achilles and the harp for David. Both men faced injustices early in their stories from their selfish kings, Agamemnon and Saul, respectively. Both men had brotherly bonds that ran thicker than blood, deep as the wells of the immortal soul, Achilles with Patroclus and David with Jonathan. Both men were tremendously skilled at warfare, striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. But most importantly, these two men share divine purpose in their stories, yet in differing ways. Achilles was favored by the Olympian gods for his divine lineage, whereas David, of no special stock, was favored by God for his heart and was given a divine lineage. As Homer's Iliad recounts a host of virtuous Greek heroes like Diomedes or Odysseus, the Old Testament likewise contains dozens upon dozens of important figures to the Israelite mind, such as Abraham and Moses, who each speak to the central idea of just what it means to be a member of the family of the one God. And while Abraham is seen as the ideal man of faith, as recorded in Genesis all the way through the New Testament writers, it is David who is regarded as the ideal, devoted king, and a messianic template that finds fulfillment in Jesus Christ, the Son of David. David and Achilles have many differences, let's not stretch it. But it's what they have in common that I believe underscores a shared, common denominator of what human beings value across time and cultures. The greatest men among the Greeks and the Hebrews are transcendent, because even in possessing immense power, they were yet wise. They were feared, yet had great capacity for mercy. They were deeply flawed in their own ways, yet repentant. Exalted even, yet laid low before the divine image. Before the stories of Achilles and David end, however, both characters undergo a sequence of life, death, and rebirth, which speak to a plethora of sorrows common to all of us: the weight of sin, the suffocating burden of death, and the ultimate promise of peace through reconciliation. Both of these characters speak to what it means to live, die, and be reborn, important archetypes for both the Jew and the Greek. Contrary to popular opinion, the Iliad is not the story of the fall of Troy. Rather, it is the story of Achilles' rage. Book 1 begins with the bitter quarrel between Achilles and Agamemnon, as I've covered on this channel, and ends in Book 24 with Achilles finding peace and understanding between himself and Priam, the king of Troy, who is the father of Prince Hector, the arch-rival whom Achilles slaughters in his rage. Everything that happens between books 1 and 24 is a result of Achilles' rage. Because he is greatly insulted and dishonored by Agamemnon at the beginning, Achilles withdraws both himself and his loyal Myrmidons from the war against the Trojans, sulking by the beak-nosed ships for a huge part of the story. Because of this withdrawal and some very specific supplication made to Zeus, the Trojans are allowed by the gods to push the Achaeans all the way back to their ships, giving Prince Hector countless Trojan victories. It's important to keep in mind that this is all allowed to happen by the will of the gods in retribution for Agamemnon's sin against Achilles. The means probably don't justify the end, but they do highlight an imperative belief for the Greeks. Nothing happens outside the will of the gods. What does happen has been decided long ago. But the Achaean losses are Achilles' losses as well. When Patroclus, the greatest friend of Achilles, is killed by Hector at the climax of Trojan domination. This is significant in that Achilles loses everything that he has ever cherished in one moment. He already lost the girl to Agamemnon, but now he has lost the friend he loved more than his own soul, along with his shining armor that defined him, and he lost these to Hector. He mourns in the black depths of despair, and Achilles' death is complete. In fact, the demise of Patroclus is the demise of Achilles, and I've lost track of just how many pages in the Iliad he spends in mourning. But Homer teaches that a man is more than the plate of armor upon his chest. Here the Iliad takes its greatest turn, and Achilles is even reborn. He's compelled by revenge to re-enter the fight against the Trojans. He receives a new set of armor and weapon from the god of the forge that Homer spends pages describing just the splendor of the shield. Achilles even reconciles the feud with Agamemnon from the beginning, and he stands up with reforged purpose. Achilles greatly succeeds. He kills Hector, he pushes the Trojans back behind their high walls, and Patroclus is given adequate funeral rites. These victories really save the Greeks, but they do not fill the void in Achilles' heart. He says the following when he recounts his life, through tears, at the end of the Iliad. "We men are wretched things, and the gods, who have no cares themselves, have woven sorrow into the very pattern of our lives." This can be compared with the sorrow of David, who lives about 250 years after Achilles. If you know anything about David already, it's likely of his unexpected victory over Goliath, the Philistine giant. And while David is chosen by God as the man after his own heart, this does not mean that David is without flaw or free from suffering. This is crucial for understanding just what makes David a significant archetype, both in the Jewish and the Christian mind, because it begs the question when you consider him against the backdrop of Achilles. When you do wrong or suffer, do you turn to God in ashes, or do you lash out in vengeful despair? Much of 1 Samuel consists of the decline of Saul, the first king of united Israel, and the rise of David, the shepherd boy who would become king. Because Saul forsakes the commandments of God as administered through the prophet Samuel, Saul's kingdom is torn and delivered over to David, but not without great suffering first. There is a scene in 1 Samuel chapter 24 that really captures David's heart in the midst of his persecution. Saul dispatches 3,000 men to find and capture David in the wilderness, despising David's perceived favor with God while losing grip of his own. There is a moment in the middle of this persecution where Saul enters a cave to relieve himself, not knowing that David is hidden within the cave's depths. While David's men interpret this stroke of luck and even encourage David to seize his moment and dispatch Saul, David in his humble heart sees things a little differently. David arose and even cut off a corner of Saul's robe, but afterward, David's heart struck him because he had cut off a corner of Saul's robe. He said to his men, "The Lord forbid that I should do this thing to my Lord, the Lord's anointed, to put my hand out against him, seeing that he is the Lord's anointed." So David persuaded his men with these words and did not permit them to attack Saul. And Saul rose up and left the cave and went on his way. If we can apply David's hiddenness in the depths of this cave as his darkest descent yet, scraping up against death, driven far from home, then his rebirth in this moment is not just what separates him from Achilles' rebirth, but it entirely reveals the heart that God has so loved and is looking for. Instead of taking the revenge of bloodlust out on Saul in this darkest moment, like say Achilles would, and which David certainly could have done, David entrusts his soul, his future, and his hands entirely to God, whatever may come, for good or for ill. In this way, David exercises attributes of the Christ archetype, that is, the refusal to repay violence for violence, but to trust in the divine sovereignty. This, of course, is not the end of David's suffering. He loses his best friend Jonathan, who David loves more than his own soul. It's a similar bond that Achilles and Patroclus share, but the tragic loss of their comrades is manifested differently between Achilles and David. One reacts externally, the other internally. One craves destruction as justice, and one entrusts justice to God. Such was David's prayer. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? The kings of the earth set themselves, and the rulers take counsel together against the Lord and his anointed, saying, "Let us burst their bonds apart and cast away their cords from us." But he who sits in the heavens laughs, the Lord holds them in his derision. As Homer teaches that a man is more than his breastplate and shield, the scriptures teach that a man is more than his sufferings. So I'll leave you with this. What will you do, and who will you look to in your time of distress? To your own strength, or to the God of justice? In these matters, we all need to choose whether to be Achilles or David. This is not the end of the discussion on archetypes, as both characters in this video still point to something greater, and in how, I believe, the one God has been able to use the swirling myths and adoring archetypes throughout history of many cultures to prepare the minds and hearts everywhere for his ultimate revelation, himself in one Jesus of Nazareth. Thanks for watching.